Oh, hi. How's it going? My name's Steve. I'm just reading the Rock Detector A to Z of 80s rock. See, they didn't call it hair metal. Today on the show, I'm actually going to do the beginner's guide to hair metal. So the idea for this show actually came from a video that Loudwire put out and they called it Is Hair Metal Offensive? And I thought, I've sort of talked about hair metal before, and I've done an episode where I've talked about the fact that hair metal is not a musical genre. And I'm going to talk about that again today. I always wondered, back in the day, even back in the 80s when, hair metal wasn't the term that was used. In fact, it was just often just called heavy metal. A lot of these hair metal bands were just called heavy metal bands. Sometimes hard rock, but I always wonder now why hard rock as a term isn't used more. Why do we have to call them hair metal bands? They're really just hard rock bands. So that's what the majority of the hair metal bands are. They're just hard rock bands that happen to come out though at a very specific time, and I think that's important too. If you're a hair metal band, if you came out probably between roughly 84 and 92, if you came out around that time, and of course you had the image and you were a hard rock band, you're pretty much now going to be called a hair metal band. I mean, not by everyone, of course. And I know there's people probably typing away right now saying, on the comments, hair metal is not a genre, it's not a nice thing to say, it's not nice to label bands hair metal. And I understand that, some people don't like it. I don't like it or hate it. I just think it's just a convenient way of knowing, a time and a type of music that we're talking about. It's just a category. It's not a genre. I totally agree about that. Because as I will talk about, a lot of these hair metal bands sound completely different from each other, and I'll talk about that very soon. But yeah, and I also think one of the problems with the term hair metal is that it has the word metal in it. And like I say, back in the 80s, a lot of the bands were sort of embracing the idea of being a heavy metal band. And they were in the metal magazines and on the Headbangers Ball and those type of shows. But really, they were more of a hard rock band. Certainly once heavier bands started coming out, and also, you compare it to those sort of traditional heavy metal bands, like, for example, all the bands that came out in the new wave of British heavy metal, but also, Judas Priest, that type of stuff, Manowar, that was more traditional heavy metal. And when you compared it to the hair metal bands, it didn't quite seem like real metal. And I think, like I say, I just think it's really strange. Always surprised me because people would ask me back in the 80s, what kind of music do you like? And I'd sort of say, well, heavy metal, but hard rock and heavy metal. I even did a radio show on, community radio station, and I called it Hard Rock and Heavy Metal Music Show because I specifically thought, well, some of this stuff isn't that heavy, some of it is, so I'm going to cover, hard rock and heavy metal. But what tends to sort of happen, I think now, is hard rock kind of isn't really used, and we just say that they're hair metal bands, or they're thrash metal, heavy metal, whatever. But, I think really for the most part, a lot of the hair metal bands were just hard rock bands. Going back to the Loudwire video too, one thing that they mentioned on it, where they were basically they're kind of defending hair metal, and they were also coming up with some of the other terms that you could use instead of hair metal. So they said, well, what about glam metal, pop metal, all that sort of stuff, and they didn't seem to like those that much. Personally, it's just, again, it's not a genre. I don't think. The only thing I'd say about things like glam metal or pop metal, that is a term that you could use at any time. So it doesn't have to be, you could be a glam metal band coming out right now. You could be a pop metal band coming out right now. It's not, I don't think it's set to a specific time. Like hair metal, it's set to, like I said before, around the early mid 80s up until the early 90s. So, so one also thing that I thought that was interesting that they said on that video is they said that Guns N' Roses is not a hair metal band. And I totally disagree with that because I think that makes things very confusing. If Guns N' Roses aren't a hair metal band, then LA Guns aren't a hair metal band. Lots of bands that sound very similar that came out of that time that are called hair metal bands. Just because a band is very good, they did very good hair metal, and they were very successful, doesn't mean they're not a hair metal band. They came out at that time. They came out in the mid '80s. Just with all the other bands, they were just one of a number of bands coming out at that time with various influences. Definitely, I mean Guns N' Roses. And I'll talk about some of the bigger hair metal bands and their influences later on. But and they did have a wide variety, but they were pretty much image wise, sound wise, a hair metal band. Now, bands like, for example, Kiss and Aerosmith, I don't consider them a hair metal band because they released music well before, the early mid '80s, and Kiss looked totally like a hair metal band in the mid '80s. They totally embraced it. They were like almost the ultimate hair metal band. You look at Crazy Nights album. I mean, the imagery and everything on that, very hair metal. Even the music, hair metal. But I don't consider them hair metal because they came out well before that. They influenced the sound of the hair metal bands that were to come out. And many of the hair metal bands sounded quite different from each other. And I'm going to go through some of the some hair metal bands and their albums and just sort of highlight the fact that they don't really sound, yes, there's similarities, but they don't really sound like each other. And actually, that was quite common when you think about, these terms that have come in to describe a certain sound and time in music. The same thing happened with grunge. If you think about grunge, the grunge bands like Soundgarden, Silverchair, Nirvana. Yes, they got put in the grunge category, but actually, and there's similarities, but they did all sound different to each other. They had their own sort of flavor. And then you had nu metal come along. And again, same sort of thing. Korn, Papa Roach, they got put in that nu metal category, but Linkin Park, but they actually do sound quite different from each other. I think grunge had a bit of an advantage too, in the sense that because I think nu metal and hair metal, are not don't always have aren't necessarily, even though they're very popular types of music. They're often not, critically acclaimed or given much sort of respect sometimes. And I think part of the problem is because it has metal in the title of the term. So grunge is lucky; it's not trying to say it's metal, but it pretty much was the alternative for people who liked heavy music. Once hair metal died, and I would listen to it and I didn't mind it. There's certainly a lot of the bands that came out in that time I enjoyed and still enjoy, but I think it kind of helped the fact that there's no metal in the term. So it's like, well, we're not trying to be metal, but it's definitely quite heavy. Some of it is just as heavy as anything that came out in hair metal times or even in the nu metal times. So yeah, also too, a lot of those grunge bands. You look at a Metal Hammer magazine from 1993, 1994, you're quite likely to see Pearl Jam or Nirvana or Stone Temple Pilots, even a band like Offspring would be on the cover of, magazines like Metal Hammer. And although the magazine's supposed to be a metal magazine, it pretty much at that time, because that was what was popular, featuring a lot of grunge artists. Anyway, let's get back to what we're really focusing on. Remember, I'm calling it the beginner's guide to hair metal. So if you're just starting out and you're going down that road of, well, what's all this hair metal about? What should I check out first? What do you recommend? Well, of course, it's all very subjective, like most music is. But I'm going to go back to what sort of got me into it. And for those who watch my channel, possibly already know this, but the album that really got me into hair metal and was the first sort of hard rock album that I really liked was Bon Jovi and Slippery When Wet. So this is a great starting point. Obviously, very well-known songs because there were lots of hits, so you may already know those songs. Another one that might be worth checking out, another band, just as a band as well, worth checking out when you want to check out hair metal, because they've got quite a few albums, is Ratt, and this is their debut, Out of the Cellar. So I'm going to just show you five that I think that are worth checking out. And then, of course, you've got the classic Guns N' Roses, Appetite for Destruction. Guns N' Roses, they are a hair metal band as far as I'm concerned. So that's your third one. Then I'm going to go with Cinderella and Night Songs. This was another very big album back in the mid-80s. Night Songs is their album. That's their debut album. And then, for my final one, so that's for my fifth and final one, they've all been American bands. And of course, hair metal was very much a LA sort of bands kind of thing. You pretty much had to sort of, a lot of the bands would move to LA to kind of get signed and get the deal and all that sort of thing. But this band, yes, there are Americans in it, but the main guy is actually German, Lenny Wolf and Kingdom Come, and their debut album. So they were all very successful albums. I really like all those albums. But here's the thing. All those bands and all those albums get put in the hair metal category. But they all sound completely different, or quite different. I mean, there are similarities, but you think about it. You hear this album, you hear this album, you hear this album, you hear this album, or you hear this album. They sound quite different from each other. And one of the reasons they sound quite different from each other is because they've actually got different influences. So the artists have been influenced by different bands. They're not obvious. A lot of these bands came out in the mid-80s with these albums, and they weren't influenced by hair metal bands. They were influenced by bands who had come before them. So I'm just going to talk about that a little bit. So like a band like Bon Jovi, I mean, there's quite a few influences potentially. If you think about bands that had a similar sound prior to them, I mean, you might suggest Survivor, Night Ranger. But I think one of the biggest influences was Aldo Nova. So, and I know that John Bon Jovi was working in the studio when this got recorded. This was actually mixed by Tony Bon Jovi, which I think is John Bon Jovi's uncle, something like that, some relation anyway. And so he's quite influenced by that, and there's definitely a sound here that carries over into the Bon Jovi, that classic Bon Jovi sound from the 80s. So I'm saying that's a big influence. For Ratt, Out of the Cellar, again, there's a few influences. I definitely would say Aerosmith, but I'm going to also suggest Van Halen. Again, they came out well before the hair metal period, but would again like Aerosmith be a very big influence on these bands. But you've got the shredding guitarists like you've got with Eddie, and you've got Warren DeMartini, of course, and Robin Crosby and Ratt. There's a similar sort of vibe, similar sound. So yeah, I think that they're a big influence on Ratt. Now Guns N' Roses is an interesting one because I said before that all those different members of the band all come together with all their own different influences, I think, and that's why you get this amazing sound. But for me, when I listen to this, I think there's quite a lot of influence from a band that came out with an album before quite a bit before Appetite for Destruction. Again, a band that certainly image-wise influenced a lot of the hair metal bands, and that's Hanoi Rocks. Axl would say himself that they were an influential band. Axl plays on Michael Monroe, or he sings on Michael Monroe's solo album. And just their image is very much, when this is early 80s, this comes out, but their image was very much like a hair metal band well before that image was really popular. Cinderella, they do go down a bit more of a bluesy road on the next sort of couple of albums, definitely. In this one, I'm going to say they're more influenced by AC/DC. There's some AC/DC influences on that first album. Not so much on their other ones, but definitely on that first one. So that's what makes them sound, different to your Bon Jovis and your Guns N' Roses, because they're taking their influences from different bands. Again, Guns N' Roses too definitely were influenced by AC/DC. So it's a mixture of different things, but they all had different sounds. And this one's a bit of an easy one, isn't it? So Kingdom Come, easy to say the influence, although I'm not sure that Lenny Wolf or necessarily the band were agreeing with this at the time, but they all were told that they sound just a little bit too much like Led Zeppelin. And I remember for me, back in the day when the Kingdom Come album came out, and I liked it so much, and I heard all this sort of criticism about, these guys, they just sound like Led Zeppelin, and I wasn't unfamiliar with Led Zeppelin, but I didn't have all their albums. I didn't know them that well. And when I did hear their songs, I thought, oh yeah, they're pretty good, but I think I prefer Kingdom Come. And I probably still, I don't know if I still feel that way, but Led Zeppelin, of course, an amazing band, but it's different for me because Kingdom Come were my band growing up, so the production sounds different and all that sort of stuff influences perhaps your opinions a little bit. I really enjoy the Kingdom Come that album, and in fact a lot of their albums I think they're great. Yep, sure, I can see the influence of Led Zeppelin, but I can see other influences or hear other influences as well. And good music's good music, isn't it? But there we go. So anyway, won't go too much into that, but there we go. So look, there's 5 albums. If you're interested in checking out hair metal, because all those bands will at some time have been called a hair metal band, and they all sound a little bit different from each other. I suggest you go check them out because they're all really good albums and good bands as well, all good bands. And some are more successful than others, but most of them really, for the most part, had fairly successful careers. Just a couple of, 3 bands I want to mention just before I finish. And I've already talked about at least 2 of these bands, but Kiss are an influence out of all those bands, I would imagine. And probably the most influential band when you think about hard rock, hair metal, bands from the 80s, or even bands coming up now today, even through the 90s. You think about the grunge bands, new metal bands, all the bands that are coming out even today. A lot of them will say Kiss was a big influence. I think, obviously, so it was a little bit different for the bands from the 80s because, again, Kiss was their band growing up. That was their sound growing up, and then they've ended up really getting into music and becoming a band. So I think that they were a major influence. And, I did talk about this band before, of course, Aerosmith. Yeah, very much a lot of the Aerosmith sound in a lot of hair metal. So it's a combination. You got your Led Zeppelin, you got your Kiss, you've got your Aerosmith, you got your AC/DC. A lot of those big bands, those big hard rock bands from the 70s, are big influences on the hair metal sound of the 80s. And just before I finish, one band that I missed back in the day, but had been really enjoying, and if there's one band who came out in the 70s but were totally a hair metal band, even before hair metal, the hair metal term or even that sort of look and sound existed, is a band called Stars. These guys I think they've got like 4 albums that came out in the mid to late 70s, and they're really good. And if you're kind of looking for a 70s hair metal band, these are the ones. This is worth checking out. So just thought I'd finish with that actually you can still find that hair metal sound, that look, that image in not even just after the 80s. You can also sort of find it if you look hard enough. And maybe again too, they were an influence on some of the hair metal bands. But yeah, there's not a lot though in the 70s that you can compare to hair metal of the 80s. But Stars would definitely be one of them. Good band worth checking out. Really strange to me that they weren't more successful. All right, that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed that. Leave your comments. Make sure you subscribe if you enjoy this type of content, and I'll be back later. All right, see ya.